So hey everyone, this is the SIG Auth KMS subproject meeting number 20 for November 29th, 2022. I think we were going to discuss, or at least top of mind for me, was discussing items for 127 and sort of organizing around that. So some like bookkeeping. So today is like, docs freeze for 126. And what that means, or doc complete, maybe freeze is the wrong word. But a week from today is code thaw, meaning master will reopen for 127. You can start merging stuff towards that. So this time of year is really weird because a lot of people have holidays, and like basically as soon as you come back in January, it's like enhancements freeze. So like it seems like you have time, but you don't, because when you take out the holidays and the fact that you come back like sort of half functioning after the holidays, there's actually no time at all. Let me actually look up the dates real fast. That way, let's see if any of the, yeah, okay. So right now, release 127 doesn't actually exist in SIG release repo right now. But yeah, code thaw is December 6th. And yeah, I expect enhancements freeze to be probably like January 10th. Or maybe January 15th. But roughly you get like a week to 2 weeks after coming back from vacation. And then you have to be all buttoned up and ready to go. So I don't know if anyone else wants to talk while I like pull up our board real fast. If anyone has any immediate thoughts.
Targeting beta in 127, do we have to, so we have to update the KEP with some of the test plan and also I think the PRR, right?
Yeah, we have to get the KEP sort of in a more complete state, because right now I think we omitted the test plan and we omitted like a lot of the graduation criteria just because we weren't sure what they were going to be, and we didn't want to like not have the KEP merge for like, what was it, like 124 alpha. So where's my instructions? Okay, so looking, is the board big enough? Should I like zoom in?
Yes, it would be nice on this device. The screen is not so big.
How's that?
Perfect.
Okay. So we had made this new handy dandy swim lane for beta blockers, which is a lot of stuff right now. And we have a lot of stuff in flight too. But I guess if we review real quick, so this one is fine. Oh, this is the same. So this is your PR, right, Rita? The one that's.
It's probably an index.
No, that's mine.
Oh, that's not.
I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll get those in pretty shortly. Those aren't big things. So let's see. In progress, we have cache stuff, which we want for V2. This one is not a big deal. It's just me refactoring a little bit. This one is not required. Reference implementation is probably the biggest thing that we have for 127, because it's sort of like, well, it's sort of how we plan on making V2 good. Right? A lot of the stuff that we want to be present there is inside the reference implementation. I think Rita, this is in review, right? This is the one that you have.
Yep. It's so close.
So close. Let's see. So other than reference implementation,
I like how Anish's PR got merged in like 20 minutes. And mine is
Me-
like so many questions. Oh my God.
Anish is famous. That's why.
I mean, if that's the case, then Rita is also famous. We're all like,
Apparently not famous than Anish, but
yeah. But I think initially, I think I asked, was it on your PR that I asked for like, hey, can we add a link here? I think
It
we-
was already, it was
Someone
after
approved it.
merged.
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you
No,
said.
I think what Rita was saying, like, so I think they LGTM'd and approved it, and then probably your comment landed after that, so it just got merged.
No.
But
I
I'm
like how not all PRs are the same. Like that one didn't even get any SIG Auth review, and that's okay.
Yes, human beings are not the most consistent process followers. Surprise. Okay, let's see. Why do I remember, Rita, you asking for this one? I thought you-
Yes, I think you were supposed to, or I was supposed to look at it. Yes. Do you want to assign it to me then?
Yes, I can do that. So, okay, so let's read this now. Hey, look, that updated pretty fast. So, that one is the bit that will allow us to do rotation with the KMS plugin changing its current status. So like without any hot reload or restart, it's just a KMS plugin saying, hey, I've changed state. And next time you do a storage migration, you'll notice. Let's see, Nilek, you have this one for encrypting everything.
yep, that's the next one on mine.
Okay. The bit that this sort of relates to for KMS v2 for me is this part, which is I wanna have a conformance suite that is not run on every PR, so you have to manually invoke it. But the only difference about the suite would be it runs with encryption on, and it just runs the regular conformance suite. And I think what I would want that to do is use like the reference implementation and encrypt everything.
Okay,
So
cool.
basically, like, is it reasonable to have a functioning conformant cluster with everything encrypted? Right, that's sort of what I'm
Makes
trying to
sense.
gauge there.
Do we already have like conformance suite, or do we have to write it basically? I guess we should have it, right? Just to
Yeah,
that
so
looks good.
I'm just talking about the existing tests we have.
Right. Okay. Cool.
So I'm not familiar exactly, you know, like how they're defined and where they're set up, probably somewhere inside of test info. But the idea
Okay.
would be to define a new one that basically reuses the bulk of the logic of the existing ones,
Sure.
but also uses encryption at rest. I have basically no idea how you get like the actual code for the reference implementation in there, like, because you know it has to be like a Go binary that you compile, and then you like invoke it and make it hold a UDS for you, and then configure the API server to use that. I have no idea how that would work. That's a thing that we would have to figure out.
It's fine. Cool. SIG infra.
Yeah, we would have to. I'm trying to think. We also would want it to like if you make a change to the reference implementation, you should be able to use this test suite to validate that you didn't break it in some horrible way, like at a high level. But that would mean that it would need to like compile and build the reference implementation example thing, like as part of like the PR pipeline somehow.
Right.
So that part's there. This one is basically, this one is basically all of KMS v2 in the bucket. I'm not too worried about that one. This is in progress, right? This is yours.
I think we can actually move to in review because Rita already has PR for it.
Yeah. So it's hard to get it to drag over. So we don't need this, right, for beta. We don't have to maintain the deck cache, right? This is more of a, like, it conceptually makes sense for this to work, right? Like it's weird that you reload and we throw away the whole cache. That like doesn't conceptually make sense, but it's not a hard requirement, right?
Yeah, and also I think in terms of behavior, it's the same as today, right? Like if you restart the API server, you're losing all your cache. So
right. So you're not gonna lose like your watch cache. That will be retained. You're just losing the deck cache. So if you try to read some data, it's not going to be able to immediately do it without talking to the KMS plugin first. I think that's probably fine.
True.
Like fine in the sense of like I don't feel the need to say that KMS v2 is not beta without this. Like I feel much more, for example, strongly about this. Like I do think we should have a suite that exercises everything. Oh, let's see, this one is also in review, right? Documenting the behaviors. That one is already in review. This one, I don't know. I'm not 100% sure if how strongly I feel about this one. This one is explicitly asking for it for like, so we have, I think, 2 integration tests today that like specifically exercise like having aggregated API server and I'm doing specific stuff with it, like playing around with its resources. So it would be good to validate that encryption at rest works for it. But this is generic for KMS. Like we should already have this test in a sense. Or I guess this is not even about KMS. This is about encryption at rest in general. So I'm less sure if this is a beta blocker for us or if it's just a thing that we want to do. What do folks have thoughts?
yeah, I mean, if it's for entire encryption at rest, I think it doesn't have to be a blocker for this one. I was thinking if it was just if we were starting off with just KMS v2, maybe we can have it as a beta blocker just so that we can include this in our test plan for the KEP.
Yeah. I guess we do need to think through exactly what the test plan is for that KEP too, right? So how about this? I'll move this over here for now, and if we end up saying that we want it in the test plan, then we'll just move that. And encryption config attempts. Okay.
Yeah, this one is like the leftover part of, or the comments that were there on the hot reload PR. This should be small, I guess, but I mean, I haven't looked into it though.
Yeah, but
yeah, I'm not sure it should be blocker though.
Yeah, so
Sorry, right.
I think I need to like rename these a little bit because I think they're misleading. It's not KMS, right? This is like, you don't have a good like acronym for this, encryption. Yes, right? Like this is generic. It's not about that. And this is actually the same thing. Oh, I can't retitle yours. Or does this work in this repo? Does anybody remember?
Yeah, I think that should work.
I just followed the previous issue naming, like we have KMS V2, so that we can just
Right.
identify everything. It worked.
No, of course I put the quotes. Okay, I was close. You don't put quotes, you just type. Now I'm gonna pretend like I didn't do that.
It's all recorded more.
I know. Okay, yeah, so I think with the, so now did these say encryption at rest there, right? I think I would be able to say the same thing here, right? Is that it's not a beta blocker for KMS v2 because this metric is about automatic reload, which is a useful feature for encryption at rest, but it's actually not related to the KMS v2 stuff. Like it's related in the sense that they're all related to each other, but not explicitly part of like the v2 effort.
True. And we have error and logs, I guess, in case it fails. So
yeah, the specific about the metrics is right now, if you're using KMS v1 and you want to use automatic reload so you don't have to do restarts, you can't observe it from the outside other than looking at the logs.
true.
So the metric is supposed to be how you understand that the API server caught up, because that's all you have today. Or the only thing you have today is API server logs. The metric would be an easier version of that, and then the storage version stuff is like sort of the end state version of that, where you have like a nice structured API that tells you the state of the API servers.
Correct. Yeah, makes sense.
I think this is in that same bucket, right? It's
Yeah, this one is to like we have like another comment from Jordan, and I think this is more like an exploration than a requirement, I guess. Like, what if we use this, then how the performance will differ and things like that.
right. I mean, it would make the code nicer to read for sure.
That's true. Yeah.
Okay, so we got a bunch of things that we may do, or we are doing as part of KMS related efforts, but they're not blockers. Now, if we look at what's left over here, I do think we have what I would consider beta blockers. We have the ability to actually have rotation without restarts for KMS v2 because the API server is actually aware of these changes. We have encrypting everything, which would then actually allow us to write such a test suite that has everything encrypted that can use the reference implementation. We have logging of the UID, so you have some reasonable way to trace the whole thing, or semi-reasonable.
Is there an issue for tests?
Yeah, so we don't have, we never wrote down what we wanted to actually have as our list of tests, right? So that I guess is something we should do in just a second. And then we have the reference implementation. So basically, right, I think right now, everything on this column and to the right is what we have to do for beta. Plus tests. So I guess I should go ahead and open issue. I'm going to ignore the templates because they're really long. So yeah. Um, um, mm, mm, mm. So many things. So I mean, so it would be unit test, can't spell. Unit test for all new code added. With the reference implementation.
Are there some guidelines like a minimal threshold, like, don't know, 90% code coverage or anything like that?
We don't have any specific guidelines, and I vaguely remember there's some where we track code coverage, but it's not like marked as like a thing that would fail your PR or anything like that. I think if you get something on the order of like 75%, we'd be like, yeah, that's probably fine. Like I don't like to chase having really high numbers there, because I think it makes people do weird things to like get the high numbers, and in ways that aren't necessarily useful for testing.
Yeah, it was just for the gut feeling. So in the prerequisite that I created, usually I was opting for quite a high test coverage. But I was curious if there's something, a minimal bar that you need to definitely reach.
Yeah. I haven't looked at it recently. I assume you ended up needing some kind of controller loop.
Yes, so there were huge changes. So the test coverage dropped because following your comments, quite a lot changed, and I think to the better, definitely to the better. The code looks now a lot nicer.
That's good. Okay. So let's see. Thinking through that, normally what I like to see for controllers is like I'm trying to think what I would call it. Like there's basically two styles of tests I like to see for controllers. One are tests that just run the main sync loop like once, or some specific number of times depending on the test, and then they like sort of make assertions about what the control loop did during that time, like it made these REST calls or did this or whatever. And the other kind I like to have is ones that run the controller a little bit further out, and so instead of running it directly, like they actually run the go routines, right? Just like fully like you would actually run a controller. And what they say is like, all right, you started at this state. Because of that, I expect you to converge at this state within some small time window. Right, so they don't look at the individual events in the middle. They just look at the start and the end, and they assert that you made it there. Those are sort of the two styles of controller tests I like to have. Like the first one tells you like, if I have this starting point, I will immediately do this next step, and I can understand that it's going to do it, and that'll give you really precise like ins and outs. But what it doesn't tell you is like, do you have weird race conditions that the race detector will notice? the only way the race detector notices anything is if you actually run separate Go routines and let it do its thing, and converge onto some state. So like those are the sort of the two styles that I tend to see. Am I making sense?
Yeah, definitely. One question, for example, the controller only acts when we did millions of encryptions or the week passed. So should I basically, like one of the comments was to make it configurable, to configure it down to maybe instead of 1 week to 1 minute or anything like that. But then it would create a test that at least takes 1 minute. And on the other side, should I maybe change the threshold for encryptions done, and then make this somehow configurable for the test?
So I think what you would want is like maybe ignoring configuration from the outside, from the public APIs for now, but make it so that at least internally, there are private variables on the struct that has the state. So that way you can tweak it inside your test however you want to. And also I would want to use the clock interfaces that we get from the API machinery packages. So that way we don't have to wait a minute. We can just say the clock moved forward to some arbitrary window, right?
Okay, yes, I will definitely look up API machinery and the clock interface. But what do you mean by changing the private values? Because
because the test is in the same package, right? It can mutate
okay.
the so like you would have like a what you call it, like a private new function that lets you pass in all the parameters that you want, and then you have a public new function with a capital N that doesn't let you pass, right? So it'll use like a real clock and a real all the real constants as its input, and the outer package, like an external consumer can't tweak those yet, and we can figure out what APIs we want to support going forward there. Maybe at a later date, so we don't have to like decide on like our public API at this exact point.
So it is basically valid to create an implementation that just so exists to satisfy testing.
Yeah, like quite commonly what we'll have is we'll have a public like new function that takes a very small set of inputs or maybe none that immediately calls a private new implementation with a lowercase n that has like all of this stuff that tests are allowed to poke at.
Okay, good. Okay.
Yeah. I'm not saying that's like the greatest way of doing code. It's just the relative pattern that we have. It works okay.
Okay, good to know, because usually it's a kind of a code smell or something like that, right? That
yeah, this is by no means the worst thing I've ever done. I've done so many much worse. I have used the unsafe package and test before to poke at things that weren't supposed to be pokeable because the whatever thing that I was poking at, the library author decided that I wasn't allowed to poke at it, and I was like, "This is not helpful." Like the Go IDC package is like one of my least favorite packages in this regard. Like none of the internals are exposed, and it makes it super hard to write unit tests, and it's really annoying. Okay. This is the thing we talked about. So like to give an idea of what I'm thinking here, right? It would be everything would be set. Let's see that all resources would be encrypted. The remote KMS would be a local encryption key that adds. So we would simulate a kind of slow remote KMS by just sleeping every time it's called, and then key hierarchy would be used. Does that make sense? Am I forgetting anything about how this would work out?
Do you want to add the like storage migration stuff in there? Like what happens when you
So
need
like
to
is related to the reference implementation or related to KMS v2 in general?
I thought this was how we're using the reference implementation to test KMS v2, right?
Right.
So in theory, everything that we are delivering in KMS v2 should be tested.
Yep.
Whether or not you use the reference implementation is question mark, depending on what you're testing.
Say that again.
Like, I don't know, like the hot reload stuff and storage migration stuff, like I think those should be tested, right? Whether or not you need the reference implementation to test that I don't know.
Right. So certainly like I would expect like a add new integration test that use the reference implementation instead of the base 64 plugin. Right. So today we have like the base 64 encrypting thing that is like a, well, I forget exactly how it works because I haven't looked at it in a long time, but it's not using any of the reference implementation code, right? So we would want integration tests at that level, and those could exercise much more fine details about the reference implementation if we want them to, or some aspect of KMS v2. The E2E, I don't expect us to have really much control over the internals, right? Because you're just going to have a real API server, and real UBS and everything, right? So it's, yeah.
So do you foresee like hot reload and storage migrations be part of this new integration test suite?
So for hot reload, I'm not worried about hot reload as much for KMS v2 because it's not actually necessary for it, right? Because one of the things that v2 has is at runtime, without any configuration changes, the plugin can tell the API server, hey, my key has changed, right? And so like the next time you call me, don't expect you expect your reads to be considered stale, right? That's the issue that you have here to implement that part, right? So once you have that, you don't, like, you could reasonably just set up KMS v2 with one config and never change it, even as you're rotating keys, because the plugin can be like polling basically like the key vault and be like, hey, what key should I be using? What's the status? Like, what's my status? And if it changes, that information flows up. So you don't actually need to change any config, right? So like you don't actually need automatic reload or hot reload for KMS v2. It's actually much more important for v1. Does that make sense?
Not really, because aren't those two things part of V2?
I mean, automatic reload you can use today without even using KMS. You can use the local keys and it's fine.
Right.
Right. All automatic reload is saying is, hey, API server, the file on disk, just keep rereading it and
Mhm.
honoring whatever configs in there. It's not related to like V2. Like you don't need the V2 feature flag set for it to use it.
Sure, sure.
So
But where would you, but that should still be part of the test suite, even if it's not part of V2, right?
I mean, it is like Nilek did write at least one integration. No, there's like at least 2 integration tests for this that tested in like different ways. But they test like the hot reload feature, like if you change the file like this, does it change? If you change the file like that, does it change?
Okay.
And that reminds me, like we probably need an issue for the gaps, right? There's one where we had a gap, right, where it was like
For the same link?
yeah, like
Yeah, I'm still finishing up that like additional test PR. And before sort of making it concrete, I want to just thoroughly test it. But we can add probably.
I'm just
Okay.
writing this here. You can
Yeah.
make an actual issue and make it something useful.
Sure.
I'm just putting it
Yeah.
and I put this in the backlog because technically automatic reload is not.
Cool.
So but all right,
What
so
about the storage migration stuff? Like, how does that fit into all the tests?
yeah, so storage migration fits in very specifically because what we're saying is if we're saying that, you know, if you have some way to observe API server state, if we don't have an API for today, but let's just say you do, then a KMS v2 plugin and change its right key and shortly thereafter running storage migration will use the new key. Right, that's basically what that's basically the promise of v2, right? Is the plugin observes new state, it tells the API server about new state, and after that point, running storage migration would use the new state instead of the old state. That's sort of the promise of the v2 API. Obviously, there's two missing pieces. One is actually the issue you have, Rita, and then the other part is how do you know what the current level API server is at? And so that's the storage version API. I'm trying to remember what is that one is. That one's in backlog. So I guess storage migration is not part of beta, mostly because the stuff we depend on isn't ready yet. We only have like small pieces of it, right? But I'm trying to think. What we want to test in regards to all this stuff. Maybe I'll just remove the 4 beta part so that way it's just here's some test stuff that we have. Is there anything is there anything outside of this that we feel is part of the API contract? So we can think about tests?
Should we look at the cap to see what things were identified as blockers?
I think we didn't, right? We didn't put anything as requirements. We basically said these are empty.
EBD.
Yes. So we have to actually decide what those are, right? We punted on it because we weren't sure, because this API right here, right? We haven't implemented any of this stuff.
Well, requirement, the checklist is ED test for all beta API operations.
In which checklist?
At the top, release sign off checklist. And then for GA is GA EDE test for meet requirements for conformance tests.
Yeah, so as far as I understand, encryption at rest is not part of conformance. Like,
sorry,
like
what's not part of conformance?
Encryption at rest, the whole concept,
Right.
which makes sense to me because it's like not observable from the outside, so it's kind of hard to have a conformance test that says anything useful about it. So I'm like I'm not sure like this applies, and like this is also unclear because these are not endpoints, because the gRPC API doesn't actually meet the normal things, right? It's like this weird thing. We can call them endpoints just and be like, yeah, we're just going to treat them that way, so that's we don't have to like guess what the difference between the two things is. But like, for example, this will never be true, right? You're not gonna, there's no gRPC endpoint to hit in conformance tests because the endpoint is part of the plugin. Right, we're the client, not the server.
Yeah. If you go to test plan, this is where we have the unit test, integration test, EDE test. So that's good. So we could
Yes.
link to that issue that you're creating. And then if you go to like rollout upgrades and rollback plans, it says we also need to update that before beta.
Where?
If you rollout updates and rollback plans, it says this section is incomplete and will be updated before the beta milestone.
Wonderful. We pointed a lot to the beta milestone.
Well, these are oh yeah, specifically called out for beta, huh? What specific metrics should inform a rollback? Okay, so upgrade and rollback should be tested, I guess.
I mean, manually, yes. There's no automated upgrade or rollback tests in Kubernetes today.
Which is part of the problem.
Well, yes.
Anyway.
I don't disagree there. I just it's an incredible amount of work to even think about what to write for such a scenario, right?
Right. So what are the metrics?
Before maybe we go on to metrics, we should
Okay.
probably have some more thoughts on like what tests we want, right? Because I will actually I will actually add one thing here though, is this as a reminder. we do need metrics. So I'm just putting it, that would almost certainly be a beta
Yep.
cluster. So for storage migration, we like let's see if I just like bullet these real fast. So you could write an integration test that so the first bit could be handled by just having more direct access. And this is what we do today in the automatic reload test. So that you could say is already met for testing purposes. So if that's the case, you should be able to have a list. Right, so that makes sense. So for the purpose of integration tests, we can cheat our way on this part, and thus we can actually write an integration test that checks this. Like basically, Rita, this is like the integration test requirements for your issue.
Yeah, this makes sense.
Okay, so that makes sense there. What other things come to mind for testing? What would I call this? Might just leave this as just a to-do, but
Do we need anything for API server identity?
so for us, the API server identity is just a value that we use in the storage version API. So I think from the perspective of KMS v2, we should just assume the value is unique and correct.
Okay.
Would you expect the API server identity to be available in the logs for KMS? Well, I mean, I guess if you have the logs, you can tell which API server it's sending the logs already.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's only if you like stuck all of them in one stream somehow and then like forgot to disambiguate that would really matter.
Right.
So like, would we feel good about this coverage as what we want for beta? Like basically, if we like clean this up a little bit, maybe put it into the cat too, would we feel like that would be good enough?
I think it's a good start. And I'm sure as we work on these, we might think of new ones.
Okay.
And we should share this maybe in the next like auth call, just to get more feedback as far as like, hey, is this good enough for beta? So we don't get any last minute surprises.
So what?
So we don't get any last minute surprises.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, I am hopeful that we can get this to beta. It will probably not be easy because there's a lot of moving pieces.
Also, going to beta will make the feature flag on by default, right?
I am not 100% sure.
Yeah, I think
Because-
that it changed recently, right? Like now it's not enabled by default.
What is?
Well, there's a big asterisk. I think it's that REST APIs are not enabled at the beta level by default. I think this one is weird because there's a feature that's beta, but then also an RPC API that's beta, but it's not a REST API. So I don't know. We should just ask. I'll just add this as an item for the agenda. Like which way should that go? And hopefully Jordan can provide us some guidance on from the API review side. So
Well, especially if this is on by default and people are upgrading, and if their providers aren't updated, what's the impact here, right?
hopefully nothing. Right? Because it should
I mean-
it should use the V1 API and not
Right,
do
right.
anything to.
Okay,
Mm, okay, so I added 2 items for next week. Good. I realize we're like at the end of the meeting. Christoph, do you still have a few minutes? I wanted to talk to you about the reference stuff.
Sure.
Okay. If folks need to
Anything-
drop. Um, I think the specifics I want to figure out is like how we can how we can start merging things basically. And I think the easiest thing might be is to like basically break it up into like really tiny chunks that are like small enough that like it takes like 30 minutes to review and merge instead of like the whole thing at once. So like I think the smallest piece that wouldn't do anything yet, but it would be a piece is the part that takes the gRPC API, like that horrible, ugly generated thing, and then wires it against the more nicer Go interface. It's basically the same interface, but like smaller, that that service interface that we have. I think that's like the smallest thing. It doesn't do anything. I realize it would do literally nothing, right? It would just be code that does a small amount of wiring. And I don't even know if you need, I don't think you need tests for that because it should be almost pass through.
So does the gRPC, does it generate an interface that we could use?
Say again?
Isn't there already an interface generated by the gRPC? What would be the benefit of creating another interface that does more or less the same?
So we have let me see if I can find it real fast. 1 second, I gotta want a different screen.
But in general, the idea is to basically the pull requests are created to split up in smaller, more iterative pull requests that are easier to review.
Yeah, so if we
Mhm.
can do that, then we can start like I want to be able to start merging things like next week. So
Okay.
that way, yeah, so like the smaller it is, the easier we can do it, and and right now we don't have the scaffolding, so it's hard for us to work on it together because nothing exists to work on together. It's just an empty folder.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
so like I think this thing, right? So we have this interface today inside of some KMS v2 package.
Yeah, you mentioned this in the pull request review, and I saw that. So I have currently on my local device changes where I start to use that interface.
Yeah, so I think like, so we have I'm trying to remember where it exists. So we have on the API server side, the client side, the client side gRPC that then just basically like implements this interface, I think. Am I remembering that right, Nish?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
It implements this interface, and I think on the server side, so on the plugin side, I think we would want to take the server side RPC and use one of these. So it's good. It'll actually end up being used both in client and server, and I think it will work just fine. It's obviously like different implementations that will be backing things, but I think that's kind of what I'm hoping for as like the starting point. That should be super small, super easy to merge, and then we can start. Like for example, like one of the implementations I want for this interface is you'll see this a lot in the Kubernetes auth code, the concept of a delegate, where you have an interface that does a small amount of thing and then immediately delegates to a different implementation of that same interface. So one implementation I want for this is one that adds delay, like an arbitrary amount of delay, right? So that way we can have like an implementation that uses the local key, and that's one static implementation, and have another one that just arbitrarily adds delays to all these calls and then delegates to some other one, right? So that way in our test environment, right, then when we want to build out the implementation, we just layer them together in the specific way we want. Does that make sense? Am I making sense?
It would be easier to follow if you would have examples, maybe, because yes.
I can find an example actually. So let me find an example in our
because I'm not familiar with all the solutions about the solution space within Kubernetes that were so something that a concept that might be very familiar to Anish and you, it's like completely alien to me, so it's sometimes hard for me to visualize what you mean, but I'm eager to learn.
So like to give you an idea, so in the Kubernetes auth stack, we have this interface called like authenticator.request that just takes a request object.
Yeah, I know that interface quite well.
Yeah, because you're probably painfully responsible for this interface, right? Downstream, because I left y'all with all that stuff at some point in the past.
Exactly, it was you on good play.
Yes, it's probably all of me somewhere in there, right? But so the gist of so this, as you can see, right, this new function takes an authenticator and just returns a different authenticator, and all it's doing is it's calling its delegate, right, this guy. And then it's like, hey, I want to add like one group, the authenticated group, and then I'm going to pass it back, right? So if you change in this example, if you change the request authenticator to that service interface, you can imagine a implementation of the service interface that literally just adds time.sleeps to all the calls and then calls the delegate, right? So that would be basically an implementation that adds arbitrary delay, right? But it doesn't care about what it's delaying. It's a separate concern, right? So we could add delays to any different implementation that we wanted for any purpose, like so however we feel, right? So you could have a local key based one, a hardware based one, whatever you want, right? Like you could have any of those, but with delay if you wanted. That's just like one of the things, right? That's kind of why I want this interface to be used, because I expect there to be a few implementations of this, some of which are standalone, and some of which are like sort of glued together in more elaborate ways, either for test purposes or for the real one. All right, like we will need like a quote unquote real one, right? That's being used in the E2E conformance in some way, shape, or form, right? So that was kind of the starting place that I was thinking of, and then we could start trying to split up sort of smaller tasks. Like I'm hoping for like a pretty modular set of things that you can put together in your own opinionated way that sort of makes sense for your requirement, right? Like for example, I want the key hierarchy to be separated in a way that you don't have to use it. I'll admit I haven't fully thought through exactly what that code looks like, but in some way, shape, or form, right? Like you should be able to say, I have my remote KMS that implements this interface, and on top of it, I add a key hierarchy or I don't add a key hierarchy, right? And if your remote KMS is actually a local piece of hardware, you don't need the key hierarchy, because the local hardware doesn't have like network IO associated with it. It's just basically as fast as your machine can do encryption. Which like on a modern Intel processor is actually really fast because they have dedicated hardware for it. Right? Am I making sense? That's kind of like the high level plan I have for this, is that like we have a bunch of different implementations of this interface and we glue them together to sort of give you the ideal that's right. Like, so, you know, for Azure Key Vault, we're going to use the key hierarchy and a remote. Like, you know, obviously we'll in the Azure implementation, we'll import the Azure SDK, implement this interface using the Azure SDK, but then layer on top of it the key hierarchy. Obviously not layer delays on there, because that would just be awful. That would just be messing with customers for funds.
Okay.
So that's kind of the thought I have, right? And hopefully we can set up the code in a way that like we can all work on this at some amount together. So that way, but yeah, ideally we start merging stuff next week, and then I'm okay if we need to like make issues that say, hey, I added this small piece and Anish added this small piece. Now those two small pieces are there. Now I have to write this test, right? Like it's okay, like if we split it up enough that even if not everything can have like the integration test, like everything should be able to have some kind of unit test pretty easily. But it's okay if you can't have the integration test yet because you just don't have the pieces yet. Like I wouldn't be surprised if it takes us like a week or two before we get to the point where actually writing an integration test is useful.
Yeah.
So again, probably stop sharing. Probably stop it too.